Hey everyone, thanks for coming to our YouTube channel and checking out Reunion. We believe that we all have a longing for purpose, meaning, and significance. In some ways, we can sum up all of these longings as a desire to find our way home. And for us at Reunion, we believe that God is home. In the next couple of weeks, we will be sharing about Reunion and who we are as a church. And our mission is why we exist and why we believe that God wants to be found even more than you want to find Him. And this mission is for all of us. It's a lifelong process. We all need help daily finding our way back to God. If you are in the Boston area and looking for a community to explore faith with, we invite you to participate with us in Somerville and Davis Square. We would love to meet you and hope you can join us. You can find all the details on our website, reunionboston.com. If you have your phone handy, you can also feel free to scan the QR code, use your camera, and it will take you directly to our connection card. Fill out the card and we'll reach out to answer any questions you might have about faith or how you can be a part of our community. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram. Now here's Nathan as he begins our series, Helping People Find Their Way Back to God.
Hey everyone, my name is Nathan and I am really grateful to be spending some time with you today. As I've been reflecting on my son starting kindergarten this past week, which came with a whole set of emotions I was just not prepared for. I spent some time reflecting on all the changes that I've seen and just the way that he's grown in the past few years. It has been like a really wild life for a 5-year-old. He moved across the country when he was a baby. He grew up in the midst of a pandemic. He didn't really see anyone or go anywhere for a fairly formative part of his life in his childhood. And yet we found ourselves here. This week he took on school. Sounds like he's made some great friends and he's really enjoyed his time there. He's just growing up like right before our family's eyes. And as I was doing this reflection, one thing that I went back to was the pandemic. During the pandemic, Haddon got really into watching movies. Now, I want to say as a family, we try not to do too much screen time and things like that. But, as many of the parents during the pandemic in here will understand, the early parts of the pandemic were really hard to navigate. And when it came to your kids, sometimes you just did what you had to do in order to survive. So Haddon got really into watching Disney movies, which you would think is a really beautiful and exciting thing. And maybe it was being isolated for so long. Maybe it was just becoming a parent and becoming more emotionally aware. Maybe it was, therapy that's trying to help me become a little bit more in tune with my emotions. Or maybe it was just something that I've never noticed before. But Haddon picked some of the Disney movies that really brought out the emotions in you as a parent. I remember one of the movies he really got into was Toy Story 3. He liked, Toy Story 1 and 2, but he really clung on to the third one. And if you haven't seen it, Toy Story 3 is a movie where Andy, who's like the boy who owns all the toys in the first two movies, is growing up and getting ready to leave for college. And I won't go through, the whole plot and everything that happens, but you get to this point in the end of the movie where it drops his old toys off with a neighbor named Bonnie. And he's doing this as he's preparing to leave for college. He stops before he gets back in his car and he decides before he leaves, he's going to play with her and his toys for a little while. It's this really like beautiful moments, this handing off to the next generation. And finally, after a while, Andy gets up to leave. He kind of looks back at his toys, and I assume he's thinking back to some of his childhood memories with those toys. And then he smiles, and he gets in his car, and he starts to drive away. And as he's driving away, it cuts to Woody, who's being held by Bonnie as she walks into her house. And you hear Woody say, "So long, partner." And I am shocked. And I look over at Haddon, who's 3 years old at the time, and he's just like completely zoned out. And he catches me looking at him because he looks back at me and I am just bawling my eyes out. And he looks me right in the eye in this moment. And he said, "Dad, can I have a snack?" And Like through tears, I'm like, bro, right now you can have anything that you want. Like, I can't take this, right? Well, there's another movie that he really got into, and that was a movie Inside Out. The movie chronicles the adventures of joy, sadness, anger, fear, and envy. These five emotions that are happening inside the head of a young girl named Riley. And while the movie is great, it's whimsical and fun and hilarious. It's pretty much everything you would expect from a movie that is like led by Amy Poehler. It also has some important things to say about our emotions and our grief and loss. And the tension of the movie is really driven by Riley's family moving across the country. They uproot their lives and they move to the West Coast. And the character Joy believes that the best way to help Riley through all of this is just to focus on helping her feel happy all of the time, no matter what is happening. So she shuts out the character sadness from influencing Riley, but instead of helping, this ends up making things so much worse as Riley becomes more and more shut off from everything that's important to her. Finally, Riley becomes so numb in the movie that she decides that what she's going to do is run away from home. She ends up getting on a bus to head back to Minnesota before all the change and loss in her life started. I think it can be really hard for us as we put ourselves in the same shoes today to hold on to these two emotions together. It's incredibly difficult to be in a position like Riley and try to process joy and sadness at the same time. And that can lead to overwhelm and exhaustion and burnout and uncertainty. The reality is, I think many of us sit in a similar space as her this morning, because I think many of us find ourselves in a similar moment. I don't think we have to just ignore the elephant in the room, that's happening. If you've watched the last few weeks, you'll know that this is our first time gathering as one location. Last week we were two. It's been a challenge. It's been a challenging few weeks for many of us. And we're at a point that is a drastic shift from how we functioned as a church in the past. Since I have been here, this is the first time that we have been a one location church. And I know that because of that reality, this morning is a moment that is a mixture of joy and sadness for many of us that have been a part of Reunion historically. Some of us, we come here and we turn on this channel and we're wrestling with, maybe the loss of a location that we used to call home. Maybe you've been connected to Metro or South End or Back Bay. And what we feel in this moment is sadness, uncertainty, disorientation. We're trying to find a way to move forward, and we're here, we're watching, but it isn't easy for us to do that. Maybe we're feeling tired from the work we put in and frustrated at what we think could have been. We're sad. And to try and pretend that this isn't the case, it would just be dishonest. And also, some of us come here today and can acknowledge the good that we might experience because of this consolidation as well. We're looking forward to being together as one church. We might be excited to forge new friendships with those around us, as one community. I think God has really good things in store for Reunion in the coming season. We can see where God is moving us, and we believe God is taking us somewhere that is going to end up in beauty. We're excited to see how that journey goes. We're ready to begin it. We have a somewhat joyful anticipation of what might be. The truth, however, is that for most of us, it's not so black and white. We feel a little bit of joy and sadness. Our emotions aren't just one or the other. It's a mixture of both. It's more complex and nuanced. We might not even be entirely sure how to say it, but we feel it. Sometimes one emotion rises over the other, but we're figuring out how to process them both at the same time. Maybe you're here today and it isn't just about the closing of our metro location. Maybe you showed up to church for the first time in a long time. Maybe church community, maybe the presence of God is something that you are longing for, and yet maybe you've had difficult experiences at church. Maybe there's been hurt in the past, and being here, it might bring some of that pain to the surface. It's both joy and sadness. Maybe you're new to the Boston area. You just moved here and you're checking us out online for the very first time. Maybe you're excited about this new adventure. And also, we can acknowledge the greater Boston area can be competitive and fast-paced and overwhelming. It can feel isolated and lonely. Many of us move here without family, and we can feel like we have no one to turn to when we're struggling with our marriage or raising our kids or finding friends or just the overwhelm of everyday life. It is both joy and sadness. Does the Bible have anything to say to us as we find ourselves in this moment? Is it okay that we find ourselves in a place like this at all? And what do we do? How do we navigate the complexity of what we feel in this moment and do it in a way that is honest and authentic as we both mourn the past and embrace excitement about the future? You know, we find the Israelites asking questions like this as they found themselves in a moment where they would have experienced similar emotions as the emotions that many of us are finding ourselves with today. To help us understand this moment a little bit better, we need to step back a little bit, though, and see what brought Israel into this moment in time. After Israel's exodus from the land of Egypt, they entered into the promised land and began to establish themselves as a nation. As this people was established, God chose the nation of Israel to represent God to the rest of the world so that other people would know him. And before all of this happens, at the very beginning, when the nation was just a few people, God made an agreement with Israel that he would bless them as long as they were faithful to him. But over and over again, that didn't happen. In fact, Israel's history is this cyclical pattern where Israel rebels and then punishment comes and then Israel repents and then God redeems. It's rinse, wash, repeat. And for a long time, despite Israel's rebellion, God continued to show grace and rescue them from the punishment that they should have incurred on themselves. At one point in the story, however, injustice and idolatry were prominent in the nation of Israel. Again, they were betraying their relationship with God. And God punished the Israelites by allowing the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar to rise in power and demolish Jerusalem in 586 BC. And this would have been devastating for the nation of Israel. Jerusalem was the place that the temple stood. The temple would have easily been one of the most beautiful structures of its time. We get a picture of what the temple looked like when we open up the book of 1 Kings and go to chapter 6. You know, the inside of the temple was this place that was completely covered in cedar. The inside of the temple had no bare walls, no ugly marks. Everything was designed intentionally to be beautiful. There were carved gourds and open flowers covering the space of the temple. This wasn't a simple building where you could just throw another building together and replicate the same thing. The loss of this space would have been devastating. But even more than that, the temple would have been this physical reminder that God was with his people. With the temple destroyed, it threw that belief completely into doubt. Maybe some of us feel that a little bit this morning. Maybe God feels distant, like he doesn't see what is happening in our lives right now. I want you to know, if you felt that way before, that is exactly how the Israelites were feeling in this moment. But even more so, because every time they would have looked up and looked to the place that was supposed to remind them that wasn't true, that God wasn't distant, that he was right here with them. Instead of seeing that reminder, they would have instead seen ruins. Although many Israelites were killed as part of this overthrow, many Israelites were also displaced. They were forced to go and live in Babylon in exile. It was this attempt to integrate the Israelites into Babylonian culture, to get them to accept Babylon as their rulers. But God promised Israel, while all this was happening, that this would not be their ultimate fate. God tells the nation that they would eventually return to their land, and it was prophesied that it would take place after 70 years in exile. And ultimately, that promise comes true. 70 years later, the Babylonians were overtaken by the Persian Empire, and the Persian king, Cyrus, declares that the Israelites can return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple through royal edict. Now, the Israelites were desperate to be back home. They're desperate to restore what was broken. But also, I'm sure they had mixed emotions returning to Jerusalem, because they're returning to see the home that they love desolate. They're returning to see their temple shattered in pieces. They are returning to the site of their failure as a people, and all the memories of idolatry and brokenness and sin. The last time that their forefathers were here, they were led away in chains with whips on their backs. And this is all the emotions that surround Israel when they find themselves in this moment, preparing to rebuild the temple, preparing to rebuild this sacred building. While Israel waited for a Messiah, while they waited for God to come in the flesh, the temple was the place that the Israelites believed God dwelt among humanity. Israel brings themselves, all of themselves, in preparation to build this structure. The anticipation of what could be, the joy of being a nation with God among them again. That's weighing on their hearts. And yet they also find themselves in the side of their rebellion, in the pain of what happened to their ancestors. They sat among the ruins of what was. Among those ruins, pain, sadness, uncertainty, all weighed on their hearts as well. We're going to pick up the story in Ezra 3 as we see all these emotions kind of begin to surface. We're going to start the story in verse 10, where we read this. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments and with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, took their place to praise the Lord, as prescribed by David, king of Israel. With praise and thanksgiving, they sang to the Lord. He is good. His love towards Israel endures forever. The Israelites kind of have their own, like breaking ground ceremony in these few verses. Despite everything that brought them to this point, their pain and their frustration and their fear, they get to a place where they can still praise God and be thankful. All of these things that brought them to this point were true and they were real, but they still recognized the magnitude of this moment that they were entering into. And the only response for them was praising God and being thankful to Him. But praising and thanking God doesn't mean you shut off the other parts of your emotions. It doesn't mean that you turn off the grief that you feel. But look at how this worship ceremony goes in these next few verses. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sounds of the shouts of joy from the sounds of weeping, because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard from far away. Joy and loss, hope and sorrow. In this moment, the nation embraced all of it. They didn't try to pretend that the past wasn't real. They didn't try to only look to the future. They didn't get stuck in the pain of the past. Israel knew that the temple that they were going to construct would be different from the temple that stood on this ground before. And because of that, because the temple was going to be different than the one before, it was a reminder to this group of what was lost. The path forward was different from what they were familiar with, but still, it was in this moment that joy and pain held hands. And that is when healing began. Remember Inside Out, the movie? Riley was masking all of her emotions, only allowing herself to feel happiness and not the depths of sadness, not the reality of her anger. And that is what ultimately led her to a place of isolation. It's only as Riley allows herself to feel the depth of her pain that she finds healing. And even more than that, it was as she made room for pain that she made space for joy to touch her pain. The result was a moment, a memory, as she was being held crying by her parents, that was both bitter and sweet, both sad and joyful at the same time. For the Israelites, it is as these, they remember what was and look forward in hope that they are being transformed into a new people. This paradoxical moment of joy and sorrow is one in which God is at work. He is restoring them to the land. He is restoring them as his people. He is delivering them once again from exile. God's people are returning to humility, covenant faithfulness, and true worship. The paradox of it all is this: the only real way forward is not to forgo or forget or to minimize pain. The way forward involves integrating our sorrow and our hurt and allowing it to shape us. Joy and loss together, that is transformative. Jerry Sitzer, in his book, A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss, put it this way: I did not get over the loss of my loved ones. Rather, I absorbed the loss into my life like soil receives decaying matter until it became a part of who I am. Sorrow took up permanent residence in my soul, and it enlarged it. And just like the nation of Israel, this moment right now, for many of us, it's a bittersweet moment. The mystery of joy and sorrow being mixed together. What many of us feel right now goes all the way to the root of the gospel. So we're talking about more than emotional health this morning. We're talking about the mystery and the paradox that in life's darkest moments, in our deepest wounds, in our greatest misgivings and sorrow, exactly there, God is present to redeem, restore, and bring life. The joy and wonder of the gospel story is that God himself enters into our deepest brokenness and sorrow. And in this complete identification with our pain, even to the point of dying on the cross, he accomplishes the great reversal. For by the pain of the cross, he brings hope of resurrection. There is a sacredness to the way God meets us and speaks to us in the dark valley of heavy loss. Psalm 34, verses 18 and 19 remind us of this, when David writes, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The righteous person may have many troubles, but the Lord delivers him from them all." The good news for you and me is that our brokenness is not beyond God's redemption. The good news for you and me is that our sorrow and grief are allowed to be horrible and real, yet still a place in which Christ can bring resurrection. The good news for you and for me is that it's okay for us to not be okay because God has made it his business to be present and at work in the bittersweet moments of our life. When we're struggling in our jobs, dealing with imposter syndrome, or sitting in the doubt of whether we can do what we're supposed to be getting paid to do, even as we're working towards deadlines and meeting goals and stuff is getting done, God is in those moments. When we mourn the pain of a loss during the holidays this year, when joy and sadness come together, God is in those moments. When we send our kids off to school each morning, anticipating will be, but also fearful of what might be, God is in those moments. And there's pain and strife in our relationships, but we still want to find a way to move those relationships forward. God is in those moments. God has made it his business to be present and at work in the bittersweet moments of life. We live in the tension of the bittersweet. But it is as our sorrow and our joy hold hands and walk together that we become people living with the hope of Christ. See, this moment wasn't the end of the story for Israel. The nation faces plenty of challenges and opposition over the next few chapters. And you can read about even more of it in the book that is Ezra's contemporary, Nehemiah. But in the end, the temple is rebuilt. The walls around Israel are restored. The story ends in hope. And maybe some of us just simply need to be reminded of that today. I would guess that some of us are watching today, and all we can see, all that we are feeling is pain. The pain is trying to drown out our joy. Sadness is trying to dominate our other emotions. It isn't bittersweet, it's just bitter. It's hard to let go of what was. It can be scary and uncomfortable and painful. And maybe some of us just need to be reminded that it's okay to be hurt and it's okay to be sad, but that sadness and that pain cannot stop us from continuing to move forward. And I would guess that some of us are watching today and all we can see and all we are feeling is joy. Things seem like they're fine. We're looking ahead to the new school year. Maybe we're looking ahead to this new season at Reunion or a new beginning in a new city or whatever, you name it. It's not bitter at all. It's just sweet. And sometimes we wrestle with the question of if it's okay to just be okay. And maybe today we need to hear that it is. It's okay to be okay, even in the midst of others who are not. But what we see in the story of Israel is a group of people who, even though they might be feeling different emotions, have locked arms together as one people. Maybe if we're feeling joyful and we're excited about the future, maybe the best thing we can do is look around the room, look around our lives at those who are not okay and simply say, there is room for your pain here. I want to be a person where it is safe for you to not be okay. Maybe we're doing everything in our power to not feel the way that we're feeling. Maybe we feel like we should be sad, but we just don't feel that way. Maybe we feel like we should be excited and we just don't feel that way. Perhaps today we can be reminded that it's good for us to be honest and to feel whatever it is that we're supposed to feel. Psychology professor and author Brené Brown says in her book, The Gift of Imperfection, we cannot selectively numb emotions. When we numb the pain of emotions, we also numb the positive emotions. My prayer is that whatever you are feeling, reunion is a place where you don't feel like you have to numb your emotions. You know, this is a big moment in the life of reunion. This is a new phase that we are about to enter into. And like Israel, when they found themselves in this moment, I think we're also building something important. Like we said earlier, the temple was at this time the place where God dwelt among his people. It was the place where people went so they could tangibly experience the presence of God. And this is what we want to embody as a church. This is why we talk about wanting to be a church that is helping people find their way back to God, because God is close to the brokenhearted. And we want reunion to be a safe place for people who are hurting and broken or just have a lot of mixed feelings about God and church. I believe reunion is called to be a place like this. That because of Jesus, the love of God doesn't need to be experienced solely in a building, but also the love of Jesus can oftentimes be experienced most clearly among a group of people. And what if, like the moment in this story, our bittersweet moment today actually became the launching point of building something beautiful? What if we looked back on this day and said, although that was a moment where things felt like they were in ruin, it was actually the moment where God laid the foundation for this next phase of reunion. And because we came to this moment honestly, we experienced God's healing and God's faithfulness in this moment. And more than that, others experienced the same healing and faithfulness because of this moment. I believe that God is working something out in our midst. And like God was faithful to Israel in their bittersweet moments, I believe that he will be faithful to us in ours. I think that we might find it might just be a moment where God began a work in and through our church that was greater than we could ever imagine. So like Israel, let's take time to sit in this bittersweet moment. Let's give space for both joy and sadness today. But in both joy and sadness, let's look to hope and remember that God is building a place for people to encounter and experience him. And that place is us, reunion. Hey, I really appreciate everybody joining us today. I want to send things back over to Matt as he closes our time with a benediction.
Open your story to the one who knows you. So much has already been written, and yet there are pages to fill. Cling to the one who has called you into something greater than yourself. May we see our scars in likeness of Christ. The marks tell our story, bear our testimony, and remind us of what was lost. May you experience resurrection with Christ. May our emptiness hold space for the work that God is still doing. Finally, let us bear witness with each other. For certain we are not alone, but bound together in Christ. One body, one people, one story. Go forth in the name of God who lives with us, in us, and around us. Amen.